Here we go. So hi everyone. I am pleased to be here with all of you and giving an online talk, and I hope this will be kind of an interesting distraction during these hard times for everyone. So my thoughts are with everyone out there and friends and people who have tuned in today. I'm going to be talking about some research that I'm currently doing on an age-old question in Mesoamerican studies, and of course that has to do with the relationship between Teotihuacan and the Maya. Now, as a lot of you know, this is a really complicated subject, and it's one that has been the subject of a lot of debate for a long time, and it will be for many years to come. So what I want to try to do today is share some ideas about the way the ancient Maya, especially in the later part of their history, looked at this great city to the west in central Mexico, Teotihuacan, and the way they represented it in their art, the way they kind of evoked it in their ideology, in their visual culture. And in order to do so, we have to talk a little bit about this very complicated history, right? And it's a history between the two areas that we're just now beginning to understand. So I'm going to start my slides here. Make sure this works. I think it will. So there we go. I hope you all can see that, my intro slide, which you've already seen. After the Entrada, some of you may be wondering what I mean by the Entrada. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. I'll explain it in a little bit. But it was a very important event in the history of all of Mesoamerica, in a sense, right? Because it really represented this moment, this flashpoint between the elite of Teotihuacan and the elite of the classic Maya. And this was in the year 378 AD or CE. It's an event that's known to many, but still poorly understood in many ways, as I think many of you can appreciate. I'll talk a little bit about it as background in a few moments, but I do want to make sure that I emphasize here that I'm not really going to be focusing on the Entrada so much. I've done that previously. 20 years ago, I published an article about it. It essentially comes down to this idea of an arrival of foreigners in central Mexico. I'm sorry, from central Mexico to the Maya area, specifically Tikal and Oaxaca area. And this was something that had first been proposed by the great Mayanist Tatiana Proskuriakov. We now know a lot about it in terms of the historical details, because now we can read the inscriptions in a way that Proskuriakov could not back in the 1960s and 70s when she was first proposing this. So let's go ahead and start here with some of the basics, just by way of introduction, right? Teotihuacan and Tikal. This is in some ways a tale of two cities, of two places, but I want to emphasize that Tikal is not the only player in the game in terms of the Maya. Teotihuacan is its own kind of self-contained civilization, but of course with the Maya, we have lots of kingdoms, we have lots of city-states that are coexisting. Tikal is, for much of the classic period, of course, one of the most important of all Maya cities. And it does seem to have been a particular destination at the time of the Entrada, at the time of the conquest. You'll hear my cat in the background. He's all excited about this talk. And the important point here is that the Entrada does not just involve Tikal. Tikal is maybe a focus of it, but there are other places, other kingdoms that we now know to be players as well in this very complicated history. So I'm focusing on Tikal in this particular slide, and I'll be showing you a lot about Tikal. But there are other cities as well. I'll be talking about Piedras Negras, which is in the western part of the Maya world on the Usumacinta River. And I'll be talking about Copan down in the southeastern zone, the southeastern part of the Maya area, where I really first started kind of thinking about some of these issues of Teotihuacan-Maya relations way back in the 1980s. Now, just so we know where we are in terms of places, right? Teotihuacan is up here in the near the basin of Mexico, near Mexico City, of course. This map is from this recent Science magazine article that some of you may know about that was focused on some of these debates about the Maya and Teotihuacan. A really nice article I would recommend for everyone as background here. And of course the Maya area over here Tikal being in the center of everything. Peterson Agras is right here, Copan is down here, so I'll be jumping around a little bit in this talk as I talk about some of this stuff. Hi Bolo, how are you? So, the other thing that's important here to realize is that, there's quite a distance here. And there's been some skepticism about the idea, for example, that the people of Teotihuacan, the elites who arrived at Tikal and in the central Maya area in the year 378 and at other times as well, that this is quite a long distance. And, the records at Tikal seem to indicate very explicitly, in my opinion, that this was a conquest in 378, a disruption of the local Tikal dynasty by someone from outside who was working on behalf of Teotihuacan. I think most Mayanists who specialize in the historical records and in the hieroglyphic texts would agree with that general assessment, but I do also want to say that when I say conquest, that's a very loaded term for us, right? And there's shades of that, I would guess. There's a disruption. There's the king of Tikal is killed in 378 on the day of the arrival of a fellow named Siakak, who seems to maybe have these foreign connections. But beyond that, we really don't understand much about what happened. But that, again, is the flashpoint for some of the discussion I'll be talking about. Here is just a general timeline. This looks kind of boring, I realize, but it's important to kind of see where we are in time. The history that I am talking about right now, when I'm talking about the arrival at Tikal and environs, is right here, smack in the middle of what we call the early classic period, okay? And so 378 is this really important event. On this timeline, of course, there's a lot of history to talk about, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the end of the 7th century as well. And also here in Copan and at Yaxchilan, Peterson Agras, these three areas. This cluster of events over here, and there are many still to talk about, these are in the late classic period. Okay, so this is important to understand from the outset. Teotihuacan is existing on a rather different time scale here on this upper line. I'm going to talk about this guy named Spearthrower Owl in just a second. He has a reign, and I happen to think he's a ruler of Teotihuacan. And one important date to keep in mind here for the rest of this presentation is around 550 AD. This is the time that more recent research has suggested to be the time of the fall or the collapse of Teotihuacan, perhaps a rather violent event and a rather sudden one. With the burning of temples. There's good physical evidence for this. Some of the earlier textbooks and source materials place this later, significantly later in some cases, but the revision of carbon dates and other aspects of chronology really seem to place it earlier than we thought a couple of decades ago, and so now we can really talk about the middle of the 6th century. Now, what's interesting here is that, as many people have realized, is that the fall of Teotihuacan corresponds, generally speaking, with this transition. It's not a hard and fast transition, but it's this shift over from the early to the late classic period among the Maya. And this is important to keep in mind, because what we have in the Maya sources, and by that I mean the hieroglyphic inscriptions and in the artwork of various sites, is we have a cluster of events in the early classic. This is direct history of interaction between Teotihuacan and the Maya. But then we have later events that are really just on the Maya time frame, right? This is after the collapse of Teotihuacan. So the Maya in this time period in the late classic are remembering Teotihuacan. They're referencing a lot of things that seem to have happened centuries before. And this is really important. The study of Teotihuacan so-called influence in Maya art has never really been talked about in terms of historical events. It's much more been about, Maya kings wanting to evoke ideology, to evoke militarism. But I am going to argue here that it really is rooted in real history and in specific individuals, in fact, specific events and specific people. So here's an example from Schiele level 25, for example, of really a wonderful example of Teotihuacan style iconography in a late classic context. This is a portrait of the ruler Schiele jaguar of Schiele. He's emerging from a snake, this fantastic two-headed serpent. I'll show an image later of the whole thing. And here he is really embodying this ancestral spirit. He is hearkening back to an earlier time. He's hearkening back on the day of his accession to Teotihuacan in a very overt way. Now, this sort of imagery has, I'm not the first one to talk about it. There have been many scholars who've looked at it and analyzed this connection between late Maya and earlier Teotihuacan. We also see it in paintings. We see it on late classic vessels, such as this wonderful Codex-style vase in the collections of LACMA in Los Angeles, with an image here of what we call the Teotihuacan Tlaloc, quote-unquote, or sometimes it crosses over to what we call the war serpent, a really complicated set of imagery. Rather hard to parse some of this. I'll come back to this later. But again, it's an example of a direct reference to Teotihuacan by a late classic Maya artist. What is he doing, or she? Why are they doing this? What is the message here? Is a big question. Now, one of the first to really call attention to this after the early classic evidence was gathered in the 60s on the Tikal project and even earlier at Ouachitun and Kaminahuyu, one of the first scholars to look at the late classic idea of Teotihuacan was Linda Schiele, my old mentor and friend and very important Mayanist. And in the 1980s, around the time of the famous exhibit called The Blood of Kings, in fact, at the Blood of Kings symposium that we had in Fort Worth, Texas in 1986, she presented her talk on what she called the Tlaloc complex, or the Tlaloc-Venus warfare complex. And what she meant by this was militaristic imagery, as you see here from this other lintel from Schiele. This is bird jaguar we see here, and he's dressed with certainly Maya elements, but there's a very overt kind of referencing to Teotihuacan. You see this Tlaloc, so-called Tlaloc face here. Some other little elements here that are a little bit more subtle than that. But this is an example of that. And this is a war, clearly. It's militaristic. And Linda was really pointing out this connection that warfare and Teotihuacan imagery go together, and specifically that it's about astronomy, tied to Venus and Jupiter and other astronomical phenomena. The timing of Maya war was kind of astronomically determined. This was a paradigm back in the 1980s that was, very influential. I remember Linda called it the Star Wars kind of model, and here, in fact, is one of these Venus or star glyphs that refers to warfare. And she was really looking at this idea of Teotihuacan really as a Maya reuse, a Maya adaptation of Teotihuacan imagery for warfare and for astronomy. It wasn't so much about history. It was much more tied to ideas of sacrifice and warfare. Another really important person who was looking at some of these ideas around the same time, in fact, was Andrea Stone. And Andrea was a student of Linda's here in Austin at the University of Texas. And in 1989, she published a really important contribution focusing on Teotihuacan imagery among the Maya, but looking specifically at the site of Piedras Negras. And here is a photograph of one of these monuments. showing a beautiful portrait of a standing warrior, a captive down below, his spear here. He's got a rectangular shield, a so-called mosaic headdress. And there are elements of this that, if you know Maya art in detail, you can say, okay, this is not really a Maya image so much as an evocation of Teotihuacan. And Andrea, her opinions were a bit different from Linda's, even though Andrea was her student. Andrea was saying, look, this is much more of a conscious reference to Teotihuacan. It's not so much about Maya ideas of sacrifice, but more of an ethnic, kind of not historical, but much more a reference to a distant place, a distant culture that was appropriated by the Maya for ideological reasons, much like we see in post-classic times as well. Can't go into all of those details right now, but this is kind of the way people had thought about this for quite a long time. Now, let's go back to the early stuff. A lot of these questions were prompted by discoveries made in the 1960s, especially at Tikal. Ceramics in the style of Teotihuacan had been found, of course, at other places. Huashactún, Kaminalhuyu in the Maya Highlands. But at Tikal, the archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania working there in the late 50s, early 60s, were really surprised to find these visual references to Teotihuacan warriors, easily recognizable by their goggle eyes, so-called tassel headdresses, frontal representation, which is something you don't often see in Maya art, like the ones we were just looking at. This frontality is very Teotihuacan, right? For those of you who know Teotihuacan mural painting and sculpture. So this is something that looks really foreign and really different. And this was clear even back then when these monuments at Tikal were first excavated. What was this about? Other examples. This monument you see here is not from Tikal, but actually from the site of Yaxha, not too far away in the Maya lowlands. And it shows, again, the rectangular shield, the goggles, this kind of frontal device in front of the mouth, the tassel headdress, and a warrior with a spear, right? So militarism. Some of this imagery is coming right out of Teotihuacan, as you can see in this comparison. This is a vessel without archaeological context, but one that probably was from Teotihuacan itself, that shows very much the same kind of imagery. So it just begged the question for a long, long time, what's going on here? Really, the first insights into the specifics of this came through translations of hieroglyphic texts. And in the 1960s, as I think I mentioned a bit before, knowledge of Maya epigraphy, of Maya inscriptions, was very limited. Despite the breakthroughs of Pritzkriakov and Konarosov and others at that time. It really wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that we were really able to read a lot of these inscriptions in detail. And one, a very famous text from Tikal, and an inscription that in fact references many of the actors who were involved in this exchange between central Mexico and the Maya area. One I'll point out here, this is the name some of you might recognize of Siakak, who was the mysterious character who arrived in January of 378 at Tikal, and the death, in fact it's recorded right here on Schiele 31, the death of the local ruler Chactoquichac is right here. I'll come back to this passage in a little bit, talking about the Entrada, but it was very exciting, I should say, back in the 80s, especially in the 90s, to start fleshing out with real history some of this interaction. This may be familiar to some of you as well, this monument from nearby Huashactún, the famous Stele 5, and Tatiana Pritzkriakov really highlighted this monument in her own analyses, surmising that this was an event of arrival, that this was this encounter of highland and lowland. Here you see this warrior who's kind of walking along, rather unusual representation. He's holding a spear thrower, atlat, right here, and a weapon right here that is unique in Maya art, in early classic Maya art, this obsidian club or sword very similar to what the Aztecs were using in the 16th century. And this kind of balloon headdress. This, as Preskuriakov identified, is a Teotihuacan warrior represented on a Maya monument. And emblazoned on the back of this stela is the date written in the Maya calendar here, but it corresponds to January of 378. This is the so-called Entrada. We don't just have this monument. We have other ones as well. And one that came a number of years later, and in fact, Preskuriakov didn't really live long enough to kind of realize, I think, the importance of this monument. Discovered in around 1982-83 in Tikal, the so-called Marcador, wonderful sculpture, rather small and unusual, but it shows the sculpture here, this rosette, an inscription down below, and some really interesting references related to the Entrada. Here is Linda Schiele's sketch of some of those glyphs. In fact, all the glyphs on the sides of the Marcador. These right here, she drew. And here's the date of the Entrada recorded here, and it says, he arrived, Siakak, right? So this is repeating what we see on Stela 31 elsewhere, and also on that Washaktun monument. There's some other things to say about this. I can't really go into all of it, but one of the protagonists of this monument is someone else who seems to be a lot more powerful than Siakak, who seems to be, I would say, holding the strings of this event in some ways. And this is the person who we call Spearthrower Owl, and I will talk about him in 1 second. I should mention too that on Stela 31, in addition to this idea of one person arriving, as we see here, right? This is Stela 31 again. Here's Siakak's name. Some of you might recognize from that photo I showed. They say some other things as well that are very interesting. In addition to him arriving, they're saying that what arrived was Ochkin Kawil, which I think we can now translate a bit better than we could even a couple of years ago, based on some new discoveries. Something like the West Authority or the West Power, really explicit record here, I think, of a new power structure coming into Teotihuacan. It's not just unique to this monument. We have the same thing on another monument from Washaktun as well. So this is an interesting way of describing this Entrada event. Also, my colleague Francisco Estrada at the site of La Afriqiyah in Guatemala came upon a painted text in a room that had a reference to the Entrada as well. And it actually was painted not long after the Entrada. They're dedicating a building, and they say 1 year and 4 days ago, prior to that dedication, Kawil, the authority, arrived at Tikal, right? So this is this idea of a new power structure, a new political order coming in. Now, here I am talking a lot about the Entrada, but I can't really get into all of the details of that right now. That's not really the focus of this. This is all just background in some ways. And again, you can look at some of these actors of this drama of 378 here. The king of Tikal, who was killed, the mysterious Siakak, who arrives on that same day, Spearthrower Owl, who seems to be calling the shots in some ways. I'll be focusing on him, really, for the rest of the talk. And another character who is the son of Spearthrower Owl, who is installed later as a king of Tikal. Finally, at Kopan, Kinichiashkukmo is the kind of local hero there, and an important character in that narrative as well. So, just to kind of summarize where we are right now, and I hope I haven't lost you in the details. We have early classic history that is very rich, and it's really emphasizing particular people and particular events. And it's focused on Tikal, and it's focused on Washington, and maybe some sites in the general area. But one of the things that I think is really important for us to realize is that this history of interaction, it's skewed a little bit in terms of the sources we have. We have some vague references at other sites as well, but my guess is that this event of 378, and especially in the decades that followed, encompassed many different kingdoms, right? Rio Azul, perhaps even as far up north as Tibanche, or even up into further north into Yucatan and Campeche. Who knows? We just don't have the evidence, partly because the excavation histories of sites are not as intense as Tikal, and the preservation and that kind of thing. We see at Tikal a lot of really great evidence because it's been studied so much. So there's a little bit of a skew there, but I just want to make sure that we all kind of understand that before we move forward. I think we're going to see a much broader interest in Teotihuacan further on in time as well. So let's go back to our slides here. And broadly speaking, the Entrada of 378, I'm sorry, that should say 378, I'll hide that. He arrived Siakak on that day from the west. They describe it as a conquest. This is really important. We're not just interpreting it as a conquest. This is how the historians of Tikal talked about it, using this term Ochchen. And Siakak seemed to have been acting as the agent of Spearthrower Owl here. Other kingdoms involved. There's this new order in Peten that is established, and it lasts for several decades. And it's really tied to the life of Spearthrower Owl. I gave a talk about this in Austin back in October that some of you may have seen, that was streamed, and went into some of those details. And then here's the child of Spearthrower Owl who becomes a ruler in 379. Okay. One of the other larger points here is that Teotihuacan and the Maya, at least the elites of these places, had really close family ties, right? They were, there were kin relations, and there was no doubt that this intense relationship goes well back before 378. Or 374. One of the reasons I use 374 here by mistake is because that's the year of the inauguration of Spearthrower Owl as a king, and I believe he was king of Teotihuacan. So here we have his name glyph, a wonderful example of his name from the Marcador at Tikal. Spearthrower Owl, I'm going to use that term of reference for him. This is not a very literal translation of his name. It's a very descriptive term. I think you can see that from this, right? Here's the spear thrower, and here's the owl, right? These are two components of his name. It's very iconic. And, this name, this glyph, this icon has been the subject of a lot of debate over the years. I have absolutely no doubt that it's a personal name. And as I've argued before, that it's the personal name of a ruler of Teotihuacan. I've tried to be skeptical about this over the years and kind of hedge on it, but the more I look at it, the more I'm convinced that we here have the name of a Teotihuacan ruler. And what's more remarkable about it is that we have a lot of references to him. What you're seeing here are variants of his name. These have been studied by a number of people as well. Priskyryakov identified this one with a spear thrower device as a name glyph. She had a slightly different name for him, but you can see there's a lot of variety here, right? Here is the bird that's part of his name, shown frontally. Birds feature very heavily in these versions as well. Notice that they're always weapons, not always a spear thrower. In this version, we have a dart with possibly a shield here. Also represented here. Here's the spear or dart with the bird. And these are a bit more complex phonetic versions that allow us to start to actually analyze the name in original classic Mayan. But that's also kind of a rabbit hole that I'll just briefly mention. As background as well, for Spearthrower Owl, Here's his name here. Here's his name here. We have his accession date in 374, as I mentioned, and we have a death date in 439. He reigned for 65 years. Remarkable reign. We don't know a lot about him, aside from his dates and his power over much of the Maya area in this time. But it's, think of these dates as kind of the brackets for this intensive interaction in the Maya lowlands between Teotihuacan and the classic Maya. Even the establishment of the Copan dynasty, as we will see, happened a bit before the death of Spearthrower Owl. So I really see this as a personal kind of time frame for his influence among the Maya. A number of individuals, not just at Tikal, but in other sites, describe themselves, you might say, as vassals of Spearthrower Owl. Here's this version of his name again here. He has this title, by the way, Kalomte, which is a title for very powerful military leaders or kind of hegemonic leaders. He's a Kalomte of the West, which is very important as well. And the point here, others have pointed this out, is that we have these local lords, maybe of Riwasul, maybe of other Peten sites, who are political vassals or underlings of Spearthrower Owl. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting. When we look at Teotihuacan art and imagery, we see something very similar, if not identical. Notice here this dart, this shield, this bird right here. This is what Hasso van Winning back in the 1940s and later identified as the owl and weapons symbol in Teotihuacan art, found especially on ceramics and also in mural painting. In fact, it's the same thing, right? It's exactly what we have in some of the Maya imagery. For my money, this is a direct personal reference to the ruler of Teotihuacan, Spearthrower Owl, let's call him that. We don't know his Maya name necessarily in all of its detail. We certainly don't know the name he had at Teotihuacan. We don't know quite what language they spoke. But we can just use this term of reference. It's the same as what von Winning called the lechuza y armas emblem. Now, one point here that's important to realize is that Teotihuacan, even though we at first may not realize it, it had its own writing system, right? This has been studied by James Langley, by Carl Taube, and others. It is a writing system not unlike that we know from later central Mexico. Lots of proper names. Here you see a figure with a name glyph. Other ones that here Carl Taube has isolated. Very hard to read, but iconic writing, emblematic writing, you might call it. It looks different from Maya hieroglyphs, very much in that central Mexican mode. And in fact, I believe that, and others have said this too, some of these emblematic forms of Spearthrower Owl's name that we see at Tikal and elsewhere seem to be using much more of a Teotihuacan way of representing this image rather than the Maya glyphs. These are, almost kind of in the Teotihuacan style, which I think is very important as well. Here are some more examples of this owl and weapons symbol that von Winning isolated here on pottery sherds, on figurines. You can see here that they all are kind of variants of the same thing, but here again at Teotihuacan we get this frontal representation. Keep these in mind. We're going to see these in the Maya area as well. And I proposed this 20 years ago, and it met with some agreement and some skepticism that this is a personal reference in the art and iconography of Teotihuacan to the character we call Spearthrower Owl. Here as a label, perhaps, or some sort of emblematic device for warriors, and here he is now in a kind of a side representation. Again, from Teotihuacan. All of these are from that area. I should point out, too, when we say Spearthrower Owl, it may not be an owl all the time. I've had these discussions with Carl Taube over the years, and a lot of these birds don't look like owls. This one, for example, looks much more kind of eagle-like, and a lot of the feather markings look like eagle feathers on some of these owls or birds, so-called owls. I agree completely, and I think it may well be that even the things that look like owls to us, like here, may in fact be eagles. The fact that we're seeing them frontally may make it look more like an owl than maybe an eagle, but that may just be us, kind of looking at a frontal eagle, thinking it's an owl. And we should keep our minds open about this. Here's another wonderful representation of this from Teotihuacan itself on a ceramic disc. A little bit restored here in the photo, and in my drawing here it just shows you the same elements that we see at Tikal, exactly the same ones. This one to me also looks pretty eagle-like, so I tend to agree with Carl that we may actually be looking at eagles more than owls with these. More name variants, we've already seen some of these. I just want to mention that, this is a bit of an open question. A few months ago, I was a bit more secure in my thinking about what his name was, at least his Mayan name. Hatzom means something like striker or hitter. I'm pretty secure on that one. But the bird is a bit iffy, whether it's a kui. Kui in Mayan languages, in a few languages, ku or kui can mean owl. It can also mean a general kind of raptorial bird, so it might even be broader than that. But something like owl striker or eagle striker is possible. Yol is the word for heart, and I suspect that is part of it as well, for reasons I won't go into too much, but we have hearts represented here. The center of the bird has been pierced by the dart here, and the circles may actually refer to centrality as well. So heart and blood, we will see, is a big part of the name as well. Something like striker at the heart of the eagle or striker at the heart of the owl, I think may well be the full name. And here we go, right? We see examples of this. These are all from Tikal. I want to point out, these are not Teotihuacan. These are from ceramics right here from Tikal. The frontal eagle or owl with hearts in its mouth. Here is the dart and the shield, perhaps. Here's the raptorial bird with a heart in its mouth. Again, elements are all there. This is the one from Schiele 31 at Tikal. This is one that Simon Martin pointed out a number of years ago in his drawing here. Later in time, from mid-6th century or so, showing what looks to be the eagle, the owl, I think probably an eagle in this case. Here is the blood being grasped by the talons of the eagle, and their obsidian blades and flint knives as the weapons that are kind of integrated into the wings of this. For my money, this is exactly the same iconic element, and it's a visual reference to the name of Spearthrower Owl, not a rather general icon of Teotihuacan authority, but a personal reference. Now, this gets us into this interesting topic of remembrance, of looking back on the Entrada. That plate I just showed you, and I'll come back to it in a second here, and I will show you. I'll kind of pause the slide so we don't all get too bored looking at hieroglyphs. But this idea of remembrance is really important. Yes, we have this cluster of early classic references, uses of Spearthrower Owl and Schiele 31 on many ceramics and so forth, the Marcador. What I want to start talking about now are these later references, these later allusions to this specific character and to other actors, perhaps at Teotihuacan. So we can start this really going back to Washaktun and Stele 22 here. What I want to show you here is this is a monument dedicated in the year 504 AD. But curiously, it just refers back to the Entrada. Here is January 378. Again, when it says the West authority arrived, why would they say something like this, right? So many decades, centuries earlier, they're marking a period ending and they say, oh, by the way, 120 years before was this huge episode that happened, right? This just merely illustrates how significant what we call the Entrada was to Washington, to the Maya of later times. And this is already into the 6th century, right? So this is a kind of a foreshadowing patterns that we're going to see later. Now, one of the really interesting illustrations of this comes from much later, right? From the end of the 7th century in Temple 1 of Tikal, this iconic architectural monument from the Maya lowlands. Inside of Temple 1, many of you might realize, were carved wooden lentils, actually preserved remarkably. Some of them are still there in Temple 1, parts of this. This one is now in Basel, Switzerland. I saw it a couple of years ago. It's beautiful. And you see here drawings of 2 different lentils. Here we see a portrait of the ruler of Tikal in all of his regalia beneath this giant jaguar. He's being shown in a litter, being carried after military victory against his rival, he's defeated, the rival of Kanul of the Snake Kingdom. Now, as Linda Schiele pointed out a long time ago, one of the dates on this particular lentil, probably referring here to the scene where he's carried around, this particular date right here is exactly 13 katuns, or 260 years, after the death of Spearthrower Owl, to the day, right? 13 katuns in the Maya calendar. That can't be a coincidence. 13 is a very important number. And sure enough, you have in the first lentil of Temple 1 a kind of a parallel image here of a figure seated with darts and spears and the war serpent and all of this Teotihuacan imagery. That's an allusion, no doubt, to Spearthrower Owl. It may even be a portrait of Spearthrower Owl. The idea here, even though Schiele didn't really talk about it in these terms, I think is that the local king is directly evoking his ancestor, because there was a family relationship, but he's also relating his conquest to that of the great, back in the 4th century. Now this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Also at Tikal, this is not a particularly new observation, because this temple facade here, structure 5D57, shows this rather clunky image, I gotta say, of a victorious king with a captive. The record here in the glyphs says this happened 13 days, here's the number 13 again, after the anniversary. And this is the display of the captive, no doubt a captive from the Kanul kingdom. Now, here we have the local Tikal lord dressed up in Teotihuacan imagery. I'm not the first to point this out, but what I do want to point out is that the headdress that he's wearing shows a eagle or an owl, shows a dart as the tail of the bird, and then it shows a Teotihuacan blood symbol right here in the center of things, right? Really cool. That to me has to be a personal reference, an iconic emblem, like a glyph that he's wearing as his headdress of Spearthrower Owl. Pretty direct, and referencing that anniversary as well. So let me just come back a little bit here. And what I want to kind of emphasize here is that we're kind of done with Tikal. Tikal is making these late references back to Teotihuacan in Temple 1 and in that other temple from the Central Acropolis. Centuries later, right? Very specific references. And they're referencing, again, in that headdress, Spearthrower Owl, I think in a very direct way, right? This model of military conquest and authority. What I want to do now is take this same idea and carry it to other sites, to other places. And I want to start looking at Piedras Negras. This is the site that Andrea Stone was focusing on when she was looking at some of these questions a number of years ago. And so here we are looking at drawings of not Tikal, but Piedras Negras. This one here is quite well known, panel 2. And here we have a close-up of panel 2. Notice the rectangular shields, this mosaic headdress. These are all elements here of Teotihuacan warrior costume or warrior regalia, you might say. Why is it at Piedras Negras? Well, it's kind of interesting to look at this. We're looking here at a retrospective event. We know this because the inscription records a much earlier event in the history of Piedras Negras with a date right here, talking about the receiving of headdresses. It's this kind of investiture ceremony involving warriors. There's one event that's happening here in the time that the lintel or panel, I should say, is carved and dedicated, but then it goes back to this much earlier event about 140 years earlier. And that's what we're seeing here. It's a retrospective event of history. So it would be unfair to say that this is a late classic king of Piedras Negras, but knowing how the Maya kind of structure their historical narratives, they're clearly trying to fold things into each other, right? They're trying to show that contemporary history is a repetition of what happened in the past, that these things are mirror images of each other. And so yes, this is an earlier reference, but it's clearly showing this Teotihuacan style that's just dominating everything right here. But what's important is to point out here that all of this is happening, it says, under the watchful eye, kind of in front of, or under the authority of someone, we don't really understand who this is. Ukabtun is the way his name is written here. And he is the West Kalomte, right? He is the Western authority, not authority, the Western, great ruler, or however, we don't really know how to translate Kalomte, to be honest. It's a bit of a mystery. But here's that Western reference again. Here's a close-up. I want to point out here, this child, a young boy or young teenager, dressed as a warrior. He's got the rectangular shield, just like probably his father here. This is interesting. I will come back to this in a second, as is his headdress here. But in Piedras Negras monuments, as Andrea Stone pointed out, we have similar costumes, right? I showed this one earlier. Again, the rectangular shields are really key. Piedras Negras is really into this military costume. This is what caught Andrea Stone's attention. What are they doing here? Why Teotihuacan? These are stelae from the 8th century. Early 8th century, maybe late 7th century too. But this is well after the fall of Teotihuacan, right? And this kind of begs the question, doesn't it? One of these monuments, Stela 9, is remarkable. Look at the headdress on this guy. It's not in great condition. This is Turbot Mahler's old photograph, and this is a drawing I did many years ago, showing this same idea, right? Here is this frontal representation of a raptorial bird. I won't say owl. Again, I think this might be an eagle. And here are the wings splayed out. This is the belly of the bird. Rather humorous image in some ways, I think. But I want to point out this detail right here. Here's the drawing again. You're looking here at what we know to be a Teotihuacan blood or heart symbol, right on the center of the bird. It's a bleeding bird. The wings of the bird are shown as rattlesnakes with the Teotihuacan war serpent. And these are essentially bent into the shape that we know from spear throwers in central Mexico and also in Maya art, right? This kind of hooked shape right here. Spearthrower owl, spearthrower eagle, blood heart, we have all the elements there. I believe that the ruler of Piedras Negras in the late classic here much like the king of Tikal that we saw before, is making a direct personal reference to this ancient ruler of Teotihuacan. And sure enough, on the shields at Peterson Agras, I've isolated a number of them here. I was very interested in these very murky images on war shields at Peterson Agras. Here's one we saw from panel 2. This is one showing the same kind of crested bird. Notice here a weapon in the side that seems to be going through the head of it. And notice these large kind of central elements. These are big heart signs, or Maya interpretations of Teotihuacan heart signs. This is essentially what we're looking at here, our Maya spins on Teotihuacan imagery. Now, the most magnificent of all of these shields at Peterson Agras has never really been seen very well until I got high-res images of the monument. And incised onto the shield is this wonderful full-figure frontal representation of a warrior. And it looks rather like this guy from Tikal. And in fact, I think it's the same thing, right? There's a lot of difference in time, and these are different sites, but think of all of these as the same thing, right? These are emblematic shields. For my money, they are emblazoned with the personal name glyph of Spearthrower Owl, much like we see in other representations at Teotihuacan. This is the bird's beak here, blood symbol down there. There's a lot of variety, and this is, I think, probably a portrait of that very individual. And again, apologies for my cat, who seems to be yelling a lot right now. Yeah, Bola, what do you think? Okay. Here's a close-up of that particular warrior with the rectangular shield. So, Peterson Agras has these interesting allusions to Teotihuacan, and surprisingly, even though we don't have Spearthrower Owl as part of the local history, they are talking about him. They're talking about him visually in these warrior costumes. In other words, it's a much more direct historical, personal connection. Moving on, just want to make clear that we're kind of following the argument here. Let me pause a little bit and come back to me for a second. So far, we've been to 2 sites, really, Tikal and Peterson Agras. In a second, we're going to get to Copan. And I promise we're well over halfway through this. I know it's kind of long. But it's important to point out some of the visual details here that lead to this argument, where we're looking at specific references to this probable ruler of Teotihuacan. In order to do that, I need to just take us a little bit into some details of iconography that have to do with the so-called Tlaloc complex and Teotihuacan art in the late Classic. And here is a case in point. This particular element right here, for those of you who know Maya art and have looked at it on vase painting or on sculpture, you've seen a lot of these things. And we sometimes call them fans. We sometimes call them butterfly wings. And here you see on Lentil 25 of Yaxchilan nice examples of this, right? Adorning the war serpent. Here it's adorning another war serpent that's a animate spear thrower. What are these things? They do cross over with butterfly wings sometimes. Fan is just a descriptor we used on the Copan project years ago. But that's not what they are, right? It's really interesting to look at them in more detail. What they are, and this is something I realized just a little while ago, is that they're probably the rear end of a spear or a dart. In other words, what we're seeing right here, the fletchings of or end feathers of a dart or arrow in Teotihuacan style. You see the dots right here with the end of the, this is kind of a feather tuft shown more naturalistically. We even see this in the post-classic period, right, or early colonial art from the Florentine Codex, for example, or other documents. When you see a representation of arrow, you usually see a little down feather tuft with a feather fletching on the back. Other examples here of Teotihuacan darts or spears. That's exactly what we're seeing right here. It's a little detail that gets added on in my iconography to say that this is a weapon, this is a dart, right? You're just seeing a part of the whole. Very common thing to do in Mesoamerican art. So you see the feather end of a dart on the war serpent here, and also even on the Tlaloc, right? Marking it, I think, as a weapon. These are all animate weapons, you know, referencing militarism, obviously. Now, this gets us into Copan, and this is going to be the last site I really talk about. Copan, of course, has many really interesting references to Teotihuacan and its visual culture. Temple 16 is a really famous one right here. This is the mosaic sculpture that adorned the staircase of Temple 16, a portrait of the sun god here that is actually an animate iconic name glyph of Kinichiashkukmo, the founder of the Copan dynasty, in a rectangular shield. Here we go, right? This is exactly what we saw at Piedras Negras with a personal name glyph in a rectangular shield. And here you have it at Copan. This is the sun god, but it's really a reference to the founder of the dynasty. Here you have this so-called Tlaloc with the goggle eyes again and 18 skulls around it as reconstructed by Carl Taube and Barbara Fash back in the mid-90s. And of course, this was right here on the front of Temple 16 at Copan, which overlay the famous Rosa Lila structure, which in turn overlay ultimately the tomb of the founder Kinichiashkukmo, right? So when you found this image here on the ultimate phase of the structure, it's labeling the occupant of the building in some ways, right? But he's using very overt Teotihuacan imagery. Of course, Altar Q, the very famous stone monument out in front of Temple 16, had the portrait of Yaxcucmo with Teotihuacan imagery. The point here is that in the late Classic, the artists of Copan are talking about their deep history, their founder, in terms of this Central Mexican connection. And the inscription on Altar Q makes this connection very explicit. It does seem to say that Kinichiashkukmo was at Teotihuacan to receive the emblems of office. Then he arrived later at Copan. Now, this is in the early 5th century, and it's a real historical event. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And even though it doesn't talk about Spearthrower Owl in the inscription, it's no accident that this ceremony that takes place at the Huitena, or this place up in Teotihuacan, perhaps one of the great temples of Teotihuacan, in fact, as Alex Tocabanina has argued, along with Bill and Barbara Fash. Temple 16 at Copan is also this particular building, right? It's a replicant of Teotihuacan architecture. And so it's really talking about him coming from that place in a very overt way. There's no accident here that event takes place within the reign of Spearthrower Owl. He's the one, again, kind of calling the shots here. So, finally, I want to get to Temple 26. And I hope I'm not losing anyone here. I hope I'm keeping your attention. I know this is a bit longer than I had anticipated, but it's fun stuff, right? It's interesting stuff. Copan Temple 26 is an ongoing project that I've been involved with, the restoration of the inscription and the iconography of this building with Barbara Fash and Carl Taube, Steve Houston, Simon Martin, Bill Fash. We've all been working on this for a while and preparing the publications. And here I wanted to point out some iconographic details. Of course, we all pay attention to the hieroglyphs when we look at the hieroglyphic stairway of Copan, but I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about the imagery on the sides, the so-called balustrade here, all elaborately carved with representations of hooked obsidian blades. These are eccentric obsidian knives used in heart sacrifice, right? Repeating one after another all the way up and down the sides of the staircase. Pretty overt imagery. Now, what is special about these? Well, look here. This is really interesting. These old pictures from the original excavation of the staircase in the 1890s shows this repeating element on the balustrades. You can see them right up here. I think you can see it, right? This kind of horizontal element of this blade is shown here, here, and here. And look what we have. We have the bird. We have these so-called fan or wing motifs on the sides, very Teotihuacan or pseudo-Teotihuacan. It gets even more interesting because if you look at the details of this, we have the arrow fletching here, but we also have this repeating element right here that is essentially the Teotihuacan blood or heart symbol. It's repeated here, and also here. There's a visual argument behind this that I'll present in more detail when I publish this, but we're looking at essentially the same three elements that I've been emphasizing. A weapon, heart or blood, or centrality, you might say, the wound, the arrow in the wound, and then the bird. We might call this an owl, but there's no reason I think why this also can't be an eagle staring at us. In other words, before I go on, that seems like a pretty personal. I would say that when this is carved in the 8th century, it is still understood to be a personal reference to the great ruler of Teotihuacan who ruled for 65 years or so up in central Mexico. He's remembered here, just as he is at Piedras Negras, just as he is at Tikal, and I think other sites too, as this great warrior and conqueror. He's a model for Maya kings who are themselves conquering and kind of expanding their own military ideologies. This resonates with the general point that I think Andrea was making many years ago. More recently, this is not Copan, but this is a vessel in Antigua, brought to my attention by Dmitry Valyalev, and I was just stunned when Dmitry showed me this. A vessel with the name of Siakak, the important person who arrived at Tikal, I should say, back in 378, represented on a late classic Maya vessel. This is not an early vessel. This is hard to date, but stylistically we would put this certainly not in the 4th century. It's probably 150, 200 years later. Hard to say, but later. Likewise, in late classic vase painting, we have, I think, pretty much the same idea here, these representations of Teotihuacan warriors. No way to really know this because we lack texts in these contexts here, in these situations, but my guess here is that these are representations that are historical in nature, going back centuries to this encounter of the late 4th century, to the time of Spearthrower Owl. That's just a guess that I'm making based on some of these other patterns. And in other late classic vases like we see here, some of the same ideas, very interesting iconography with fans and weapons and possible bird pelt here. And there's one in particular that really blows my mind. Wasn't quite ready to see this when I noticed it last year. This repeating element on this particular vessel in this rollout by Justin Kerr. Here we have the dart fletching, the arrow fletching here, the weapon essentially. We have a blood or heart symbol in Teotihuacan style with the flowing blood out here. And then we have this spotted element here that you might think at first, oh, that's just jaguar pelt, but it's really not jaguar pelt. In looking at this stuff recently, I've noticed that when you get a lot of these strings of dots and parallel lines, you're not looking at jaguar pelt, but you're actually looking at eagle or owl feather down, or kind of balls of feathers. Again, there's another separate visual argument for that I can get into in my publication. But here we have exactly the same combination, right, in different terms and using different elements. I would hazard to guess that this is probably a iconic, almost Central Mexican style, or pseudo Central Mexican style glyph that is the personal name of who we call Spearthrower Owl, and that they're referencing him on this late classic vase from the Kanul Kingdom, or somewhere nearby. This one too is pretty interesting, right? It's a pretty well-known plate. It's been published a couple of times. Beautiful plate showing a seated Teotihuacan style warrior. You'll notice the war serpent here, but I want to point out what he's sitting on. This is the weapon, right? Here is that blood or heart symbol. Another stylized Teotihuacan heart is down here. This is the tail of a rattlesnake. Here's the head, of course, right? So this is the war serpent piercing this circular element, and this, of course, is the eye or goggle of the bird, right? It's a very reduced or reductionistic version of the same idea. But weapon, bird eye, and heart and blood, again shown together. I would think this is also a personal reference to Spearthrower Owl, and I think the reason is that is his name, and that's a portrait of him. Again, this plate dates to the 8th century by style, from the Central Petén. Yet, if it's referring to Spearthrower Owl, it's centuries later, right? This fits the pattern that we've seen in sculpture elsewhere. So you might offer a parallel, perhaps, between this plate and what we were seeing in Teotihuacan ceramics, right? Here is the name of the warrior, a portrait of the warrior, name of warrior, portrait of warrior. Now, I'm right at the end. And in closing, I would like to really focus here on Lentil 25 for a second. This is a pretty misunderstood image, in my opinion. A lot of people talk about this as a vision serpent, and it's a term that I really don't like. This is not a vision of someone who's hallucinating after a blood sacrifice. This is an image of a king being inaugurated. This is an image of Schiele Jaguar on the day of his accession, assuming the role of warrior. And in doing so, he must embody the spirit of the ancestor who himself was warfare, or who embodied that quality. That's the message of Lentil 25, and the text makes that very clear. In fact, the main event here, the date of the accession of Schiele Jaguar, it says, Ut akau uk awilil ut hok pakal. He conjures the kawil of war. And again, kawil is a term that isn't just a god. It's not just a idea of a spirit, but it's this idea of authority, this idea of power. And the sense here is that he is manifesting that quality on the day of his accession. And he's manifesting the power of, literally it says here, of the war, of the weaponry, the knife and shield of this ancestor who's named right here, right? So he's embodying that primordial figure at Yaxchilan. That's the idea. But the visual language for this message is about Teotihuacan. It may not be here about Spearthrower Owl. I don't want to stress Spearthrower Owl here is the focus, but we do have all the elements here that really make that message clear. Teotihuacan, much as Linda Schiele and Andrea Stone and others said a long time ago, is the template for militarism in the late classic. It's the template for conquest. It's the template for warfare. And I don't see this as a very abstract thing. I see this as a specific historical thing. the idea after 200 or 300 years evolves out of a specific historical circumstance. It evolves out of the Entrada. It involves a very complex political arrangement that we still don't understand, but it was pervasive enough in the Maya world to leave a mark, not just at Tikal and Washactun, but at Piedras Negras, Copan, and Dos Pilas, Aguateca, a lot of other sites as well that I didn't even have time to get into. So I think I am at the end of my talk. I just want to come back here and thank everyone for listening to me. I think that went on a long time. Some of you, I hope, are still with me. I have to say, a lot of these ideas are still in progress in my own mind. I'm still working on them. I'm working on a book or a monograph devoted to Spearthrower Owl and some of this history, maybe not all of it, because it is very complex. And a lot of this dives right into this whole question about Teotihuacan and its system of governance and political organization. And that is a very controversial topic. But I know from the Maya sources, the way they talk about Teotihuacan in their own history, that they talk about people, very powerful individuals that they call rulers, that they call conquerors. And I think this has great importance in understanding some of these larger questions about Teotihuacan. But putting that to a side, right, I really wanted to focus here on how the Maya are representing it, right? And the Maya are focused not on Teotihuacan so much as this concept, but really as an active role player in Maya history, right? And that Spearthrower Owl was the dominant figure of that period of interaction in the late 300s and in the early 400s. So it left its mark on the Maya world. So thank you very much. I'm at the end of my talk. I want to conclude by thanking all of you, of course, and thanking Boundary End for having me give their first live on-stream talk. I want to thank in particular John Daigle for the technical help in getting this going in the sound issues. It was inevitable something would happen, right? And I also want to make an announcement here about the next upcoming talk. We don't have a date for it quite yet for the next Boundary End talk, but it's going to be by Richard Deal, the well-known Olmec and specialist and Mesoamerican archaeologist who's worked at a number of places, but he's going to be talking about the site of La Mojara. So do keep an eye out on this. We're going to make an announcement about it. Please go to the Boundary End website for more information. If you'd like to support Boundary End, we would be so appreciative. We're trying to do some special things there, and it's a beautiful place nestled in Appalachia, devoted to the study of ancient America and Mesoamerica, and we have some good things going. So I appreciate all of your help and appreciate your presence here, and hope this was interesting. And stay well, people. Stay safe, and we'll all get through this really rough time. And I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.